It's a great joy to be here with so many friends, old friends like Dharmadas and Diana, and hear so many wonderful things said about yourself that you didn't even know about. And it's just a great pleasure and a great joy to be here in India. My wife could not make it this trip, but she sends her blessings. Her name is Maria. And she is actually responsible for a lot of new things on the Ananda website. She took it over after I left. We jokingly call it a family business, but it's Ananda's spiritual family. And it is a wonderful example, as Dharmadas said, about the power of Kriya Yoga. People who didn't know from the internets before they started working on these projects, and all of a sudden we have these beautiful creative expressions of Yogananda's ideals in so many ways. It's really, Kriya Yoga really accelerates your spiritual growth. You can say that by just looking around yourselves at Ananda. Jaya was talking yesterday about how he first met Swami Kriyananda, and he, almost the first thing he said, I want to learn Kriya Yoga. And I had the same response the very first time I read the Autobiography of a Yogi. I was very fortunate to be very young and to have a deep aspiration for divine union. I knew that I wasn't going to be living a normal life of career and success and all these things. I really wanted something else, and I didn't know how to do that. I had a good idea of what it might be. I understood realization and moksha and these concepts, and I knew that that's where I wanted to go. But where I was at the time, to a very much stronger degree than I am now, was deep in delusion and the emotions and all the karma and all the suffering that we all go through. So I really was yearning to find out, how do I get from here to there? And I want to get from here to there as quickly as I can get there. And then I read Autobiography of a Yogi, and it confirmed my feelings about what I wanted from life. And then I came to the chapter on the science of Kriya Yoga. And it was all about hastening your spiritual evolution and getting there, getting divine realization, finding God, finding union, finding moksha, even possibly in this lifetime. It was such, to me it was thrilling to read that. And so the first thing I wanted to know was, just like with Jaya, I want to learn Kriya Yoga. And so I came to Ananda. And I can say that Kriya Yoga has fulfilled its promise over the years. It does hasten spiritual growth way out of proportion to what you think it would for what is really a very simple practice. And I can say it, if it was just one or two people whose growth it hastened, you could say, well, these are maybe exceptional people. But you see so many people over the years throughout the world with Ananda Sangha who practice Kriya Yoga for 5, 10, 20, 30 years, even 1 year. You see their lives transformed, and you see amazing transformations of spiritual growth due to the path of Kriya Yoga. How does Kriya work so effectively? There's a chant that we chant at all of our Kriya initiations at Ananda, and whenever I work at Ananda Village with helping people prepare for their first Kriya initiation, we learn this chant. And it's a chant that Sri Yukteswar used to sing, and it's about the science of Kriya Yoga. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. And the words are, desire, my great enemy, with his soldiers surrounded me, is giving me lots of trouble, O my Lord. That enemy I will deceive, remaining in the castle of peace, night and day, in thy joy, O my Lord. Lord, tell me what will be my fate. And the Lord answers, pranayam be thy religion. Pranayam will give thee salvation. Pranayam is the wishing tree. And that is how Kriya Yoga transforms our life. It's very simple. Kriya Yoga is a pranayam technique, but most importantly, as Yogananda taught, pranayam, he said, is a condition. It's a condition of being in control of your life force. And when you have control of your life force, you can do anything. Swami Kriyananda has recently been writing a new article, and he just sent a copy of it out today. I just saw it via email. And we think of Kriya Yoga, or sometimes people do, as something that was dusted off the old bookshelf from centuries ago and brought back to life. But Swamiji, this article that he's writing, the latest one, is about religion in the New Age. And he essentially says the same thing that chant says about pranayama being now salvation, but also being the religion and the scientific technique of this modern era. He wrote today, hot off the press, "Inasmuch as yoga deals not only with mental and physical techniques of self-development, but with direct control of the inner energy, pranayama, or energy control, it will come to be recognized as an actual science of religion. It will become, I say this with confidence, the human science par excellence for the new age. Yoga meditation practices will be used to test the claims of religion by helping people to get in touch with their superconsciousness and thereby to be guided by soul intuition." And I'll repeat, he says with great confidence, the human science par excellence for the new age. I was with a group of our new up-and-coming Kriya Bandhs just before their Kriya initiation recently. And I had taught them this chant about pranayama be thy religion, which is exactly what Swamiji is saying in that passage. Pranayama be thy religion. It will give thee salvation. And so we had been singing this chant, and we were visiting a shrine at Ananda where we have sacred relics of our line of gurus. And they were playing some music in the background. And the CD was actually playing that same chant that we'd been singing. And one of the soon-to-be Kriya Bandhs, this young lady, she said with sort of breathless devotion, she said, "They're playing our song." And this is something that in the West, maybe an older couple many years after they've been together, maybe when they were younger and falling in love, there was a song that expressed their ideals and their love for each other. And many years later they hear it and they say, "They're playing our song." For the Kriya Yogi, that is our song, not necessarily that specific chant. It is for me, I love that chant. But the idea behind it, which is that pranayama will give thee salvation. Pranayama is the wishing tree. Control the little pranayama, as the chant says. Become all-pervading pranayama. You won't have anything to fear anymore. And that is the path of Kriya Yoga. It's partly a technique, it's partly a set of techniques, but the purpose is to give us control of the life force. When we have control of the life force, then we can achieve anything in our lives. The way Swamiji describes it, he talks about this energy that's rising up and down the spine, and it's out of control. It goes up in little spurts, and we feel really happy and giddy and emotionally happy. Then something happens in our life, and it starts shooting down the spine, and we'll feel sad, and we feel heavy, and we feel bummed out. And our life is just a roller coaster ride, up and down, time after time. What pranayama does, and the way Swamiji describes it, he talks about the reactive process, which is that we react to events that happen in our lives. So something happens to us and we get all jump up for joy. Something sad happens to us and it pulls the energy down. And we are no longer in control of the life force. It's an out of control life force rather than an in control life force. And so Kriya, what it does, in the way that Swamiji explains, the first step is it really starts to magnetize the spine, and it starts to increase the flow of energy up and down the spine. And by increasing that flow, it starts to draw us into our center. And then we draw that energy into the deep spine where we find union with God. But more importantly, it starts to give us control so that rather than events causing us to lose control up and down the spine, it gives us the control to bring it and unite it at the spiritual eye at will. In other words, we can be happy, we can be joyful, we can be uplifted at will. This is the way Swamiji explains this. He says, this is how you absolutely control your destiny, by getting control over the energies in your own spine. This is how you can free yourself from karma, from all the ins and outs and ups and downs of the world. You finally reach the point where you can go through this world and nothing can ever touch you again. This is the state of Jivan Mukta, or inner divine freedom. We go through life and we have many battles in life and many tests. And it's the nature of Maya to dazzle us with all our problems and all of our karmas, and we rush from one thing to another and one test to another. But in the end, there's really only one battle that we have to win. There's one battle you can almost ignore all others. If you win this one battle, you will win the war, you'll win all the other fights. And that is the battle of winning control of the life force, gaining pranayama and control of the life force. That's why Kriya Yoga is so effective. It gives us that control over time, over practice. And this is not a technique that's just for a select, very few. Yogananda once said that he could take a few young men of the coarsest type, teach them Kriya Yoga, and they would become saints in a few years. And we have all seen this at Ananda over the years, whether it's young men of the coarsest type or normal, average people. People practice Kriya and they are changed. Kriya Yoga works. There's a way that Kriya works effectively, and that is that it gives us inner strength, inner power, so that all the outer tests, suddenly they don't go away, they just become very small. I had a sort of a dramatic experience of this not too long ago. It was a few years ago. And it was one of the most amazing energization exercises stories, which you probably don't hear many stories about the energization exercises, but I was on my front porch doing the exercises, and around the corner walked a skunk. And do you have skunks in India? Okay. A skunk is a small little animal that sprays a really, really foul smell as a way of attacking people. And it's so foul that it just burns your eyes, and it's like being hit with pepper gas or something like that. So you want to be very careful around these creatures. And they tend to be very shy and bashful, and they don't tend to be aggressive. But they're a wild animal in the wilderness of Ananda Village in California. I was doing my exercises, and I was doing the ankle rotation as he came around the corner. And I just saw him, and I said, okay, I'm here. And I didn't want to alarm him. And I said, just go on your way. There's nothing to see here. Just move along. And he must have seen my ankle moving, and he must have had bad eyesight or something, and maybe thought it was his friend. But he ran right up and grabbed onto my foot. And he wouldn't let go of my foot. He held on for dear life. People who know me know that strange things often happen to me in nature, and so I wasn't very alarmed by it. But I was pretty surprised, and I looked at him, and I started talking to him, and I said, please let go of my foot, and please move on, and because I could see that there wasn't going to be much good coming out of this situation. And he just held on, and he wouldn't let go, and I started talking louder, you have to let go of my foot, and he still held on to my foot. I started yelling at him, let go of my foot, and he still wouldn't let go. And so finally, as with many, many tests and trials that we have, it took me raising my level of energy and getting control of my life force. And so with all of my strength and energy, I flung my foot as hard as I could, and he went tumbling through the air. And because skunks, their smell can be really, really difficult to deal with, I ran inside my house and slammed the door shut. And he sprayed all over the front door just as I shut the door, and everything was fine, and we all lived happily ever after. But it was a good example of how to overcome tests and challenges in life. We're going to continue having tests, karma, all these things come up. And it's until we become fully liberated, which is a process that takes some time. We're going to go through all this tests and karma. And the problem isn't out there. The problem isn't all these battles and all these fights and all these tests that we have to win. The real battle, like I said, is only one, and that is to get control of the life force, to control the energy in the spine, to develop the inner strength and the inner power. And if we fight that one battle and win that one battle, all these other tests they fall away just because you just sort of fling your foot and there goes that test there and you brush this one aside. But if you don't have control over the life force and these tests come, then you're battered this way and that, and you get all emotional, you get all upset, and you start complaining about your karma and it's too hard and this and that. So Kriya Yoga gives you victory over yourself, which is the real battle, and it gives you victory over all this karma, all these problems, all these tests, and gives you final victory in the end, as this reading from Swami Kriyananda. Even Jivan Mukta, complete freedom in God, complete freedom in divine joy. People wonder sometimes if Kriya Yoga, how practical it can be, because here we are talking about this very cosmic reality. We live in a very mundane world. We have to work, we have to earn money, support a family, raise children. We have karma to fulfill, a career, art or business or things like that. How practical can something be where you sit with your eyes closed and bring energy that is not really material up and down the spine? Well, in fact, it's very practical. If you look at the lives of Kriya Yogis, lifelong Kriya Yogis, it actually makes them better at business. It makes them better at writing. It makes them better at music. It makes them better parents. It gives them control over their life force and gives them victory over all these seemingly mundane realities of a material world. Rajasi Janakananda, Yogananda's most advanced disciple, was an extremely successful businessman who would show up at his office every morning, take his shoes off, and he would meditate till 11 o'clock or so. All his employees knew that that's what he was doing. And then he would be able to fulfill all the responsibilities of running this huge multi-million-dollar business because he had control of the life force. Most people, in contrast, put all of their assets, all of their investment, using an investment analogy, into the senses and into the body. And if you think about the body and the senses and everything you experience through it, it's what in the financial world is called a very quickly depreciating asset, which means that the value of your body, it's inevitable that the value of your body by the end of this life is going to be zero. Someday, someone will ask, "Oh, where's Dave been? Have you seen him?" And the inevitable answer will say, "Oh yeah, I saw his ashes floating down the Ganges last week." That's the inevitable result of the senses and the body. And yet people put all of their life force, all of their energy, all of their dreams into living through the senses, living through the body, fulfilling material desires. And if you think about it as a financial investment, it's a really, really bad investment to make. The other side of the coin is when you feed the soul, practice Kriya Yoga, learn control of the life force, and become free in God. This is something that increases over time. And a perfect example is Swami Kriyananda. Look at his body. It's the same as everybody else. Maybe worse. All the parts are falling off and they're wiring it back together, and it's inevitable that it will end up the same as all of us. But because he's been putting his assets, his investment, his energy, his life force into feeding the soul, into serving God, serving Guru, practicing Kriya Yoga, his increase is in divine joy. It's in divine awareness. And that is something, even if you don't believe in reincarnation, you can see it in his life, that his body is not so great, as all bodies do. That's the inevitable course of nature. And yet he's in divine bliss at the end of his life. And he's still writing, and his mind is clear. So this is where we should be putting our life force, our energy, is into learning pranayam. Pranayam be thy religion. Pranayam will give thee salvation. Pranayam is the wishing tree. It will fulfill all of your deepest desires because it gives you complete control over yourself. Other side of this again is that if you feed the senses, feed the body, feed the ego, you start identifying with this little self. And as a result of that, you start suffering with this little self. I recently had a experience. It was an example of how karma is such a little thing. We put so much emphasis into karma. My karma, I'm suffering. And, even a whole lifetime is a very blink in the eye of the Creator and in the, evolution of all of our lifetimes. But karma is very, very finite. It's very limited. It has a finite cause. It has a finite effect. And yet, we identify with it. We think, I'm this person, I'm that person, I'm feeling this pain, I'm suffering and I'm so sad. And we get smaller and smaller. In Kriya Yoga, and this is where Kriya really is extremely effective, it changes our identification from our little selves and from our karma to our infinite self. And so when karma comes, it's not such a big deal anymore because we're not identifying it. We're identifying with the ocean of spirit. I had an experience. It was just, I wouldn't say it was trivial, but it was a good example of how karma works. And it was not intense enough where I got caught up in it, but was able to observe it. For many years, I had a pain in the bottom of my foot. And I always thought that there was something stuck in there, a piece of metal or something like that. And 15 years ago, in fact, it happened when we were in Seattle, and Dharmadas and I were up there, is when I first started feeling it. And doctors x-rayed it, and they cut it open and couldn't find anything. And so for 15 years, I pretty much ignored it, except that there was always this pain in my foot. When I'd walk a certain way, there'd be this sharp pain. It would come and go, and it was just one of these little karmas. And it was little enough that I wasn't identifying with it. But recently, my foot was being treated for some other condition, or so they thought. And all of a sudden, one day I was poking at it, and this big piece of glass came out. And it was a 1/4 inch long, which is almost half a centimeter long. Is that probably about right? And then this thing had been moving and floating and kicking around for 15 years. Every time I stepped, it was doing something in there. Most of the time, I didn't notice it. But it was an interesting example of how karma has a beginning, it has an end. And if we get caught up in all of our many, many karmas, then we give it infinite power over ourselves. But if we just let the karma work itself out, it will end. Don't worry about it. Whether it's just a little pain in the foot. It wasn't a great pain. It was, I wasn't suffering or anything, but it was a good example of how karma has a finite beginning and a finite end. And if I was to identify with my foot, if my whole reality was in my foot, yes, I would have suffered and would have spent 15 years complaining and whining and having all these problems. But I don't identify with my foot, fortunately. I do identify with other karmas of mine, but my foot is one that I'm relatively free from. But it's a good example that when you free yourself from identification with the small self, you're also free of the karma. And the way you do that, and this again is how Kriya Yoga really is important, and really is in the end how it really transforms us. Kriya, by giving us control over the life force, helps us to start uniting the energy at the spiritual eye, and it starts to take us into deeper and deeper states of deep meditation and communion with our reality, which is Sat Chit Ananda, ever conscious, ever existing, ever new divine bliss. And as we meditate over the years, we start getting little glimmers of that divine joy. And then maybe it gets deeper and deeper over time. And every time we touch that bliss, and every time we commune with it, our identification changes from this little self, from all these little karmas, from my foot and from my suffering and from my pain and what this person did to me and all these emotions that we have. and it starts identifying with who and what we really are. And as we start changing our identification, our consciousness expands. All these things that seemed so big before, these tests that seemed so big, suddenly seem so little, because we're swimming in the vast ocean of bliss. And that really is why Kriya Yoga, in the end, is so powerful. It takes us to that identification. One thing we have to always remember is that Kriya is just a technique. And sometimes people, especially Westerners I've noticed, get too caught up in the technique and focus on the technique and giving all the time to the technique and the minutiae of the technique, which is good. It's a good discipline, and that's an important part of the path of Kriya Yoga. But more important to understand is that Kriya is just a vehicle for taking us to the goal of swimming in that ocean of bliss. It's Yogananda called Kriya the jet airplane route to God. And just to practice the technique alone would be like getting on that airplane, and it lands, after, it's a long, long flight, I can tell you, from America to Delhi. It's about almost 30 hours from door to door. You're not in the plane the whole time. But imagine landing in Delhi, and I can tell you that about 2 hours before you even land, you're thinking, please let me off this plane. I want to get off this plane. You've been on it so long. And to practice Kriya Yoga without communing with bliss afterwards would be like staying on the plane. Say, oh, I don't want to get off and be with my friends and share the bliss of satsang in Gurgaon with my fellow devotees. It would be like staying on the plane. So Kriya, and this is why Lahiri Mahashai emphasized that perhaps the most important part of Kriya practice is what he called the after effect poise of Kriya, which is really another way of saying the bliss of deep communion with God that Kriya gives to us through long, devoted practice. And so, really, as you work with these teachings, realize that Kriya gives us pranayam, but most importantly, it gives us communion with God through that control. And spend more and more time over the years tuning into that joy, tuning into that bliss, and realize that that joy, that grace, the grace of God which comes through divine bliss, is what really transforms us. Dhyana will be talking a little bit more about that, but also about one aspect of Kriya that I'm not really going to talk about, but I just want to touch on at the very end here, which is that it's not just us fighting the battle of life. It's not just our little self fighting against this out-of-control life force that just seems overwhelming. It's not just us against the world and us against all of our tests. In the great battle of Mahabharata, the battle of Kurukshetra, you remember that Arjuna talking to Krishna and trying to get encouragement about how to fight this great battle, which was really the inner battle of life, the one that we're all fighting. Arjuna had a few things that were extremely helpful to him. One was he had his brothers. He had all his fellow warriors and soldiers, just like we all have. We all have our brothers and sisters here, our satsang, our fellow Guru Bhais, our devotees who give us the strength to fight the battle. If your enthusiasm for Kriya Yoga and pranayama and learning these things ever wanes, just call up a Kriya Yoga buddy and say, I need your help. You have to get me back here going, and let me come over and meditate with you, or go and meditate over at 10 by 8 or any of our group meditations, and you'll get the strength to fight again, just like Arjuna did with his brothers. But also, even more important, is in the battle of the Kurukshetra, Arjuna had a charioteer, a chariot driver, Krishna, his guru, driving his chariot and giving him the power and the strength to fight the battle. So it really isn't just us against this out-of-control life force. We have the techniques of Kriya Yoga, we have the Guru's grace, we have each other. Call on all these aspects of Kriya Yoga, because Kriya Yoga is a spiritual path that includes all of these things. And Dhyana will talk about more of these aspects now. Namaskar.